Am I wrong for choosing family over my partner? I'm sharing this story because I genuinely don't know if I handled things the right way. It's one of those situations where you think you're doing the right thing, but then someone you care about deeply makes you question everything. I hope you'll listen to what happened and let me know if I went too far or if I'm justified. To start, I've always had a close bond with my sister. Growing up, I was her protector, her confidant, the person she leaned on when things got tough. Even as adults, we've maintained that connection. So, when she approached me last week with a very personal and unexpected request, I wasn't entirely surprised, but I was caught off guard. My sister is pregnant and due to give birth soon. She's been dealing with a lot, including issues with her husband. Despite everything, I never expected her to ask me, her brother, to be in the delivery room with her. It's not exactly the typical role you'd think of for a brother, right? At first, I was confused and didn't know how to respond. I asked about her husband, thinking maybe he'd be the obvious choice. She said he's been unpredictable and might not handle the situation well. Then I brought up our mom, but she shut that down too, saying she didn't want to burden her. That's when she told me that of all people, I make her feel the safest. She said she needed someone who could keep her calm and grounded, and she trusted me to do that for her. I agreed to consider it, but I knew I had to talk to my wife before committing. Little did I know that conversation would open up a whole new set of challenges. When my sister first asked me to be in the delivery room, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions, honored, confused, and slightly uneasy. It's not every day that your sister asks you to be a part of such an intimate and vulnerable moment. My initial reaction was to try to make sense of it, so I asked her why she felt I was the right person for this role. She explained that things with her husband had been rough lately. They were having some unresolved issues, and she didn't feel he would be emotionally steady enough to support her during labor. I could hear the hesitation in her voice as she spoke, like she was admitting something she hadn't even fully processed herself. She mentioned that he tends to panic in high-pressure situations, and the thought of having him there was making her more anxious than comforted. Naturally, my next thought was our mum. She'd been a strong support for both of us growing up, and would likely jump at the chance to be there for my sister. But my sister shook her head, saying she didn't want to add any extra stress to our mom's already full plate. Then she said something that really struck me. She told me that I've always been her safe space. Growing up, I was the one who stood up for her, who kept her grounded when things felt chaotic. She said she couldn't imagine anyone else being there with her, and knowing I was in the room would make her feel completely at ease. It was a heavy thing to hear, both the trust she was placing in me and the vulnerability behind her request. I told her I'd need to discuss it with my wife before giving her an answer. She thanked me, clearly relieved I was even considering it, but the weight of her words stayed with me. It was a request I wanted to honor, but I also knew it wasn't a decision I could make on my own. After our conversation, I kept replaying my sister's words in my mind. The trust she placed in me was undeniable, but the situation felt unusual. I wasn't sure how to process it entirely, so I decided to dig deeper into her reasoning. If I was going to be in the delivery room, I needed to fully understand why she wanted me there. The next day, I called her back to clarify some things. I asked her again if she was absolutely sure this was what she wanted. It's not that I doubted her sincerity, but I needed to hear her say it with conviction. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "You're the only person who makes me feel like nothing can go wrong." Her words were both reassuring and daunting. On one hand, I was touched that she saw me as this figure of stability. On the other, I felt the weight of what she was asking me to do. Labor isn't just another family event. It's a deeply personal and intense experience. I couldn't shake the feeling that there might be boundaries I wasn't seeing. When I brought up her husband again, she was honest. "It's not that I don't want him there," she said. "I just can't take the risk of him panicking and making things harder. I need calm, and he can't give me that right now." She sounded almost apologetic, like she hated even having to make this decision. I told her I'd think it over and emphasized that I'd need to talk it through with my wife first. She said she understood, but there was a quiet hopefulness in her voice, like she was counting on me to say yes. As much as I wanted to be there for her, I also knew this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. After talking to my sister, I decided to bring up the idea with our mom. Part of me thought maybe she'd step in and make the situation easier by volunteering herself as the support person. It seemed like the natural solution. After all, who could be more comforting to my sister during such a critical moment than our mom? When I called her, I tried to ease into the conversation. I explained my sister's request and how unexpected it had been. As I described her reasoning about her husband's unreliability and not wanting to burden anyone, I could almost hear my mom nodding through the phone. She understood the context immediately. "That sounds just like your sister," she said. "She's always been thoughtful, even to a fault." I pressed further, asking if she thought it would be better for her to be in the delivery room instead of me. There was a pause. Then gently but firmly my mum said, "She knows what she needs, and if she's asking for you, there's a reason for it." Her words left me more conflicted than reassured. I asked her why she thought my sister hadn't asked her first. She chuckled softly. In that way moms do when they see something their kids don't. She probably knows I'd be a nervous wreck. She's protecting me as much as she's asking you to protect her. That comment struck a chord. My sister wasn't just making a practical choice. She was navigating everyone's emotions and trying to find the best way to feel supported without putting too much on anyone else. It made sense, but it didn't make the decision any easier for me. By the end of the call, my mom had made her position clear. She trusted my sister's judgment, and she trusted mine. "Do what you think is right," she said. Simple words, but they left me feeling the full weight of the responsibility. Now it wasn't just about honoring my sister's request. It was about whether I could live up to the trust both of them were placing in me. After my conversation with Mom, I felt more certain about the importance of my sister's request. It wasn't just about her needing someone in the room, it was about her feeling safe and supported in one of the most vulnerable moments of her life. I started to see this less as an unusual favor and more as a unique expression of our bond as siblings. That night I called my sister to give her my tentative agreement. I told her that yes, I was willing to be in the delivery room with her, but there was one condition. I needed to talk to my wife about it first. I emphasized that this wasn't something I could decide unilaterally. It involved both of us, and I needed to make sure she was comfortable with it too. My sister's relief was almost palpable. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking just a little. "You have no idea how much this means to me." She went on to explain that she hadn't even felt this relaxed about her pregnancy until I said I would consider it. It made me feel good, knowing I could give her that kind of reassurance, but at the same time, it made me more anxious about the conversation I needed to have with my wife. I ended the call by telling my sister I would let her know soon, depending on how things went at home. She thanked me again, and I could tell this decision had already lifted a significant burden off her shoulders, but as I hung up the phone, the weight shifted onto mine. I realized that while I was trying to be there for my sister, I was also walking into a potentially difficult discussion with my wife, one that I wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. When I brought the topic up with my wife, I tried to ease into it. We were having dinner, and I casually mentioned that my sister had called with a request. At first, she seemed curious, but as I started explaining the details, her expression shifted. By the time I finished, she was staring at me, her fork frozen mid-air. "She wants you to be in the delivery room? With her? As in, during the actual birth?" My wife's tone was a mix of shock and disbelief. "Yes," I said carefully. "She's been dealing with a lot, especially with her husband, and she feels like I'm the one who can keep her calm." My wife set her fork down and leaned back in her chair. "I've never heard of anything like this. A brother in the delivery room. It just feels inappropriate." I could feel myself getting defensive, but I tried to keep my tone measured. "It's not about appropriateness. It's about what she needs to feel safe. She's going through a hard time, and if I can help her, why wouldn't I?" She shook her head, clearly unconvinced. "I get that she's struggling, but this isn't a normal request. Delivery rooms are private, intimate spaces. It's a moment between a mother and her partner, or maybe her own mom, not her brother." Her words stung, but I understood where she was coming from. For her, this was an unfamiliar dynamic, something outside the bounds of what she'd consider normal family involvement. But for me, it wasn't about tradition or norms. It was about being there for my sister in a moment she felt she couldn't face alone. The conversation continued, but it was clear we weren't on the same page. I explained my sister's reasoning, trying to make my wife see that this wasn't just a random request. It was a deeply emotional and personal one. Still, her initial shock didn't fade. As we cleaned up dinner, I realized this was only the beginning of what would likely be a much longer discussion. The next day, my wife revisited the conversation, this time with more pointed arguments. She'd had time to process the initial shock, but her stance hadn't softened. If anything, she seemed more convinced that this was an inappropriate request. "Look," she began, "I understand that you and your sister are close. I do. But this feels like it's crossing a line. Labor and delivery are such private moments. It's not something siblings are usually involved in." I nodded, trying to stay calm. I get that it's not traditional, but it's what she feels she needs. Isn't that what matters? She sighed, clearly frustrated. It's not just about what she needs. This impacts us too. How would it look to other people? Have you thought about how strange this is going to seem? People might not understand. Her focus on appearances caught me off guard. Why does it matter what other people think? This is about my sister, not anyone else. It matters, she said firmly, because it's not just about her. You're married now, and the things you do, especially something as unconventional as this, reflect on both of us. I don't want to feel like I'm married to someone who doesn't consider how these decisions affect me. That comment stung. I hadn't seen this as a reflection on our marriage, but rather as a moment to support my sister during a critical time. It's not about disregarding your feelings, I said. It's about being there for my family. Well, your family is supposed to include me, she shot back. The conversation ended there, tension hanging in the air. I started to realize just how deeply this disagreement was cutting into our relationship and how far apart we were in seeing the situation. For her, this wasn't just a question of helping my sister. It was a matter of loyalty and boundaries. After my wife's strong reaction, I felt compelled to defend my position more clearly. I understood her concerns about boundaries and appearances, but to me, this wasn't a matter of public perception or marital loyalty. It was about doing what felt right for someone I deeply cared about. That evening, I sat down with her again. "I hear what you're saying," I started, trying to set a conciliatory tone. "But this isn't about breaking boundaries or making you uncomfortable. It's about helping my sister feel safe in a moment when she's scared and vulnerable." She didn't respond immediately, so I pressed on. "You know how much she's been through lately. Her husband isn't in the right headspace, and she doesn't want to burden my mum. She feels like I'm the only one who can give her the support she needs." "But why does it have to be you?" my wife finally asked, her voice softer but still firm. "Surely there are other people, her friends, maybe. Why does it have to fall on your shoulders?" "Because she trusts me," I said simply. "She told me she feels safe with me in a way she doesn't with anyone else. And honestly, if I can give her even a little peace of mind in such a high-stress moment, I don't see why I shouldn't." My wife looked at me, a mixture of frustration and something that almost resembled hurt in her eyes. "I'm not saying you shouldn't care about your sister," she said. "I'm just asking you to consider how this makes me feel. I feel like you're putting her needs above mine." That stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't fully considered that angle, how this request, as selfless as I thought it was, might come across to her as prioritizing my sister over our relationship. I tried to explain that it wasn't about choosing one over the other, but the tension between us was growing. I could see how much this was bothering her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that being there for my sister was the right thing to do. As the days went by, the tension between my wife and me only grew. Every time the topic came up, it felt like we were speaking entirely different languages. She saw boundaries being crossed, while I saw a chance to be there for my sister in a moment of need. Neither of us could fully grasp the other's perspective. One evening, after dinner, the discussion turned heated. My wife started by saying, "You're not listening to me. This isn't just about your sister, it's about what this says about our relationship." That line hit me hard. How does supporting my sister have anything to do with our relationship? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "This is about her feeling safe. Why is that such a problem?" "Because you're not considering how it makes me feel," she snapped. I'm your wife. Shouldn't my comfort matter in this? Shouldn't we be making decisions together? I leaned forward, trying to rein in my frustration. I'm not disregarding your feelings, but my sister is going through something deeply personal and difficult. If I say no, I'll be letting her down when she needs me the most. How can I live with that? Her eyes narrowed, her tone turning colder. And how can I live with a husband who prioritizes his sister's needs over our marriage? That comment stopped me in my tracks. For the first time, I realized just how deep this disagreement ran. To her, this wasn't just about my sister. It was about the balance of our relationship and how we made decisions as a couple. But to me, it felt like she was asking me to choose between two people I cared about deeply. And no matter which choice I made, someone would end up hurt. After that argument, I spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. The weight of the situation was starting to feel unbearable. On one side was my sister, someone I'd always protected and supported. On the other was my wife, the person I'd chosen to build a life with. Both of them were asking for something that in their minds seemed reasonable, and yet their needs felt entirely at odds. I started questioning myself. Was I being too stubborn? Was my wife right to feel like I was putting my sister first? Or was she overreacting to something that wasn't as big of a deal as she thought? The lines between what was fair and what was selfish were starting to blur. The thing that stuck with me most was my wife's comment about priorities. I didn't see it as a matter of choosing one person over the other, but I could understand why it might feel that way to her. From her perspective, my willingness to agree to my sister's request without hesitation might have seemed like I was dismissing her feelings entirely. And maybe in my eagerness to help my sister, I had done exactly that. At the same time, I couldn't ignore what my sister had said about feeling safe with me. It wasn't just a simple favor she was asking, it was about her emotional well-being during one of the most challenging moments of her life. How could I turn her down, knowing that? The conflict within me was overwhelming. I hated feeling like no matter what I did, someone would be hurt or disappointed. I wanted to find a way to make both of them understand my position, to bridge the gap between their perspectives. But with emotions running so high, I wasn't sure if that was even possible. For the first time, I truly felt stuck, unsure of which direction to take or how to navigate the growing divide in my life. The next morning, I decided to make another attempt to reconcile with my wife. I didn't want this disagreement to spiral into something irreparable. More than anything, I wanted her to understand where I was coming from, not to agree entirely, but at least to see my side. We sat down in the living room, and I started by acknowledging her feelings. I know this situation has been hard on you, I said, and I understand why you're upset. This isn't something either of us expected to deal with. She nodded but stayed silent, waiting for me to continue. I don't want you to think I'm ignoring your feelings or that I don't care about how this affects you, I said. But I also can't ignore what my sister is going through. She's in a tough spot, and she's asked for my help in a way that feels deeply personal. I just feel like I'd be letting her down if I said no. My wife sighed and leaned back, crossing her arms. I hear you, but it still feels like you're prioritizing her over me. I'm not asking you to abandon your sister. I'm asking you to think about the bigger picture here. What does this mean for us, for how we make decisions as a couple? Her words hit me hard. It was clear that for her this wasn't just about the delivery room. It was about how our relationship functioned and whether we were truly partners in the decisions we made. I tried to explain that this wasn't about choosing sides, but rather about trying to balance two very different needs. Despite my efforts, the conversation ended in the same place it had before, unresolved. We were stuck in a cycle, unable to find common ground, and it was becoming increasingly clear that this situation was testing the core of our relationship. Feeling the strain in my marriage, I decided it was time to have an honest conversation with my sister about everything. I needed her to understand the toll her request was taking on my relationship. While I wanted to support her, I also felt trapped between two people I deeply cared about. I called her and asked if we could talk. She immediately picked up on the seriousness in my tone. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you about this delivery room thing," I said. "I've been trying to work it out with my wife, but it's not going well. She's really uncomfortable with the idea and it's causing a lot of tension between us." There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, my sister said, "I didn't mean for this to cause problems for you. I didn't know who else to ask." "I know," I replied, "and I understand why you came to me, I really do. But you need to understand that this isn't a simple decision for me. My wife feels like I'm putting your needs above hers, and that's hard for her to accept." My sister sighed. "I'm sorry. I guess I didn't think about how this would affect your relationship. I was just so focused on how much I need you there." Her words carried a mix of guilt and vulnerability. I could tell she hadn't considered the ripple effects of her request, but it wasn't coming from a selfish place. It was coming from a place of genuine need. "I want to be there for you," I said, "but I also need to find a way to make this work with my wife. Otherwise, I'll end up letting one of you down, and that's the last thing I want." We agreed to keep the conversation open and revisit it later. My sister's understanding gave me a bit of relief, but the reality of the situation hadn't changed. I was still caught in the middle, trying to balance two conflicting priorities. That evening, I sat down with my wife for what I hoped would be the definitive conversation. I needed to lay everything out plainly and try once again to bridge the gap between our perspectives. "I spoke with my sister today," I began. "I told her about how this has been affecting us and how much this situation has upset you. She understands and she feels bad about putting me in this position." My wife looked at me, her expression softening slightly. "And? Did she change her mind?" I shook my head. "Not exactly. She still feels like she needs me there, but she doesn't want this to come between us. She's willing to talk more about it if that helps." "She's willing to talk more?" My wife repeated, a faint edge of irritation returning to her voice. "But what about you? What do you actually want?" That question stopped me for a moment. "I want to support my sister," I said carefully, "but I also want to respect your feelings. I know this has been hard on you, and I don't want you to feel like your concerns don't matter." "They do." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's just, this feels so unusual, so outside what I'm comfortable with. And it's hard not to feel like you're choosing her over me, even if you don't see it that way." "I'm not choosing her over you," I insisted. "I'm trying to find a way to be there for both of you. You're my wife, and your feelings are incredibly important to me. But my sister is in a vulnerable place, and I feel like I'd be failing her if I didn't help." The conversation ended with no clear resolution. We were both exhausted, emotionally and mentally, and the distance between us felt heavier than ever. After days of back and forth, sleepless nights, and emotional conversations, I realized I couldn't delay my decision any longer. Both my wife and my sister were waiting for clarity, and I owed it to them and to myself to make a choice. That evening, I sat down alone to think. I weighed everything: my sister's vulnerability and trust in me, my wife's discomfort and the strain this was putting on our relationship, and my own sense of responsibility. No matter how I looked at it, someone was going to feel hurt or disappointed. But avoiding the decision wasn't helping anyone. In the end, I decided to honor my sister's request. It wasn't a choice I made lightly, and it wasn't about disregarding my wife's feelings. It was about being there for my sister, in a moment when she had no one else to turn to. I knew it would mean dealing with the fallout in my marriage, but I couldn't shake the feeling that saying no would leave me with a regret I'd carry forever. I went to find my wife and told her my decision. "I've thought about this a lot," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "And I've decided to be there for my sister. It's not because I don't care about how you feel. It's because I can't turn my back on her when she needs me most." Her expression was unreadable at first, a mix of frustration and resignation. "I knew that's what you were going to say," she replied quietly. "I just wish you could see how hard this is for me." "I do see it," I said, "and I hate that this is causing so much tension between us. But I hope you can understand why I feel this is the right thing to do." She didn't respond right away, and the silence between us felt heavy. I knew this wasn't the resolution she wanted, and I could see that it hurt her. But I also felt a strange sense of clarity, like I'd finally taken a step in a direction I could live with, regardless of the consequences. The days following my decision were tense, to say the least. My wife and I were polite to each other, but there was a noticeable distance between us. She wasn't outright angry, but her frustration lingered in every interaction. It was the kind of tension that didn't need words to be felt. One evening, she finally broke the silence. "I'm trying to come to terms with this," she said, her voice calm but strained. "But it's hard. I feel like you didn't really take my feelings into account, no matter how much you say you did." "I did," I replied, leaning forward. "I've thought about everything you said, and I understand where you're coming from. But this wasn't about choosing one person over the other. It was about being there for someone who has no one else in this moment." She shook her head. "It's easy for you to say that when you're not the one being left out. You've made your decision, and I'll accept it. But I need you to understand that this has changed how I see things." Her words stung more than I expected. "Changed how you see what?" I asked hesitantly. "Us," she said simply. "How we navigate things as a couple. I don't feel like we're on the same page right now, and that scares me." I sat there unsure of what to say. This wasn't what I wanted. I'd hoped my decision would lead to understanding, but instead, it felt like a wedge had been driven deeper between us. I reassured her as best I could, telling her that I valued our relationship and wanted to rebuild the trust this situation had shaken. She nodded, but didn't say much else. I could tell this was far from over, and while the immediate decision was behind us, the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Once my decision was final, I shifted my focus to supporting my sister as the delivery date approached. She was incredibly grateful, which gave me some reassurance that I was doing the right thing. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about my wife's words and the tension that still hung over our home. I spent time researching what to expect in the delivery room. I wanted to be as prepared as possible so I could truly be the calming presence my sister needed. I read about labor stages, breathing techniques, and how to offer emotional support during contractions. It felt strange to dive into a world I'd never imagined myself being part of, but it also made me realize the magnitude of what my sister was entrusting me with. My sister and I had a couple of phone calls to go over her birth plan. She explained what she wanted the atmosphere to be like: quiet, supportive, and stress-free. She emphasized again how much my presence meant to her. "Just knowing you'll be there makes me feel less anxious," she said during one of our conversations. "I can't thank you enough." While I was focused on getting ready, my wife remained distant. She didn't bring up the situation anymore, but her silence spoke volumes. I tried to involve her in other aspects of our life to bridge the gap, suggesting date nights or casual conversations about unrelated topics, but she seemed uninterested. It was clear that, in her mind, this wasn't resolved. As the delivery day grew closer, I felt torn. On one hand, I was committed to being there for my sister in her moment of need. On the other, I couldn't ignore the growing divide between my wife and me. It felt like I was walking a tightrope, trying to balance my loyalty to my sister with the damage this decision had caused in my marriage. All I could do was hope that time would heal the wounds and bring some clarity to the complicated situation I found myself in. The day finally arrived. Early in the morning, my sister called to say she was in labor and heading to the hospital. I grabbed my things and headed out, a mix of nerves and determination swirling in my chest. This was it, the moment she had been counting on me for. When I arrived at the hospital, my sister was already settled in the delivery room. Her face lit up when she saw me. "You're here," she said with a shaky smile, relief evident in her voice. I took her hand and reassured her. "I'm here. We're going to get through this together." The hours that followed were intense. Labor was far more physically and emotionally demanding than I had imagined. My sister alternated between moments of calm and moments of pain, gripping my hand tightly during each contraction. I did my best to stay composed, offering words of encouragement and reminding her to breathe through the discomfort. At one point, she turned to me, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for being here," she whispered. "I couldn't have done this without you." Hearing that made all the stress and tension leading up to this moment feel worthwhile. It was a deeply humbling experience to witness the raw strength and vulnerability it took for her to bring life into the world. When the baby finally arrived, the room was filled with an overwhelming sense of relief and joy. My sister looked at her newborn with tears streaming down her face, then turned to me and smiled. "You were my rock," she said. I felt a swell of pride and gratitude for being able to support her in such a meaningful way. But even in that joyful moment, I couldn't ignore the nagging thought of what awaited me at home, the consequences of the choice I'd made to be there. When I got home later that day, I was emotionally drained but still riding the high of what had just happened. Supporting my sister through the delivery had been one of the most intense and meaningful experiences of my life. I felt proud of the role I'd played, but I also knew the reality I was walking back into. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. My wife was in the living room scrolling on her phone, but she didn't look up when I entered. I set my bag down and hesitated for a moment before sitting beside her. "I'm back," I said softly, trying to gauge her mood. She glanced at me briefly, her expression unreadable. "How's your sister?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "She's doing well," I replied. "The baby's healthy, and everything went smoothly. It was an incredible experience." I hoped that sharing a little about the day might open the door to a more honest conversation, but her reaction was muted. "That's good," she said simply, returning her attention to her phone. The weight of the silence between us felt heavier than ever. "Can we talk?" I asked after a moment. She put her phone down and turned to face me. "What's there to talk about? You made your decision, and now we have to live with it." Her words hit harder than I expected. I tried to explain what the day had meant to me and how much I appreciated her patience throughout this ordeal, but she cut me off. "I'm glad you were there for your sister," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "But it's hard for me to celebrate that, when I still feel like my feelings were an afterthought." I didn't know what to say. I had hoped that time, or the simple act of being back home, might begin to heal the rift between us. But in that moment, it was clear that the fallout from my decision was far from over. The joy I felt from helping my sister was now tempered by the growing distance in my marriage. In the days following the delivery, I found myself reflecting deeply on everything that had happened. Helping my sister through labor had been one of the most powerful experiences of my life, but the joy and pride I felt were overshadowed by the tension at home. My wife and I weren't fighting openly anymore, but the emotional distance between us lingered like a heavy fog. I replayed our conversations in my mind, trying to pinpoint where things had gone wrong. Had I been too quick to agree to my sister's request? Had I failed to prioritize my wife's feelings in a way that truly mattered? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the delivery room, it was about how I had handled the entire situation. At the same time, I couldn't bring myself to regret being there for my sister. Her words of gratitude, the look on her face when she held her baby for the first time, it all reinforced that I had done something meaningful. But was it possible to do the right thing for one person and still be wrong in the eyes of another? I started questioning the broader implications of my actions. What did this mean for my marriage? Had I unknowingly set a precedent that my wife would struggle to accept? Or was this just one of those moments in a relationship where compromise and forgiveness had to take center stage? Sitting alone in the quiet of our home, I realized there were no easy answers. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could try to rebuild what had been strained. The challenge now was finding a way to make things right with my wife without invalidating the choice I had made to support my sister. It felt like a delicate balance, one I wasn't sure how to achieve. As I sit here reflecting on everything, I can't help but feel like I've reached a crossroads. On one side, I have my sister, someone I've always protected and supported, who trusted me to be there for her in one of the most vulnerable moments of her life. On the other side, I have my wife, the person I've committed my life to, who feels betrayed and sidelined by the choice I made. Looking back, I can see how my actions might have hurt my wife. Her concerns about boundaries and partnership were valid, and maybe I could have done more to address them before making my decision. I understand now that to her, this wasn't just about the delivery room. It was about trust, loyalty, and the way we navigate challenges as a couple. At the same time, I can't ignore the gratitude my sister expressed. Her words made it clear that my presence gave her the strength and calm she needed in a moment of uncertainty. For her, it wasn't about breaking norms or creating conflict. It was about finding safety and support when she felt most alone. And I'm proud I could provide that for her. But the question remains, was I wrong? Did I fail to prioritize my wife in a way that I should have? Or was I justified in choosing to be there for my sister, given the circumstances? Could I have handled things differently to avoid this fallout altogether? I've told you my story, every detail, every decision, and every emotion that led to this moment. Now I need your perspective. Am I the asshole for agreeing to be in the delivery room with my sister, even though it hurt my wife? Or is this just one of those impossible situations where someone was bound to feel let down? I'm genuinely asking because I want to grow from this experience. So please let me know, was I wrong? And if so, what should I have done differently?